This video is specifically about the back end of the bike and where you should sort of try and aim for with where the saddle should be relative to the cranks.
As far forward as it can go. I know they do that.
Yeah, just shove it as far forward as it can go. You'll be right, man. So
that's one thing I do know.
Yeah. So this is one of those situations where Steve Hogg once said to me that, or I remember reading a blog post that he'd written, that marketing has overcome reality here. There was a move 20 to 30 years ago it started, where basically people started creeping their TT saddles further forward. And the idea was that it would open up your hip angle so you could drop down to the bars more and you would get out in front of the bottom bracket and be more aero, right? And this is a fantastic idea, except that it comes with so many downsides that people didn't consider at the time, which I'm going to try and go through a bit with you in this video. So you've got to resist the urge to shove your seat as far forward as it can possibly go. Most TT bikes have got such steep effective seat tube angles that even having the seat like in the middle of its range is usually too far forward. This depends on a lot of other things, but you might want to consider not having it that far forward, and I'll show you why now. So what I've drawn you here, Cam, is a graph.
Oh.
Mate, we are going up in the world, and we get a better close up of this.
Yes.
I've drawn you a graph. This is basically a graphical representation of what occurs when the seat is too far forward. When the rider's pelvis is pushed way forward over the bottom bracket, they get into a situation where they're basically applying downwards force on the pedal for a very, very short duration of the crank's rotation, which is just across the bottom of the stroke. The way to visualize this is imagine if the cranks were way out behind you and you were just kicking them from, like a backwards kick, right, that you'd see in like a soccer match or something. That kick is what occurs when the pelvis gets way in front of the bottom bracket or just too far forward. That means that all of the force is being applied over a very narrow arc of the crank's rotation. It tends to create, when you graph this on a sine wave, effectively a sine wave of the rider's torque output or force to the pedals, you create very high torque spikes. These high torque spikes are great. You think, well, I'm putting more pressure on the pedals, right? Which is what this shows. However, the rotational duration of the crank over which the force is applied becomes very narrow. It basically becomes a situation where instead of pedaling smoothly in circles, you are just kicking the pedal like this, right? So the height of those spikes, but the shortness of the duration, this is a graphical representation of a lack of pedal stroke efficiency. The height of the peak contractile effort that you're putting to the pedals, the downwards force on the pedals, there is a linear correlation between that spike, the height of the spike, and muscle fatigue. So it's in your interests when you're producing long steady state efforts to look at the area under the curve, right? Which is basically widening the duration of crank rotation over which the force is applied. So in other words, pedaling more smoothly, but with a lower peak contractile effort, right? You actually want the torque spikes to be lower for efficiency. I'm talking very specifically about time trialing here. So if the seat is too far forward, you start to kick the pedal, you get this very high torque spike, which the paradox here, this is where it gets interesting. When you shove the seat way forward, you feel more powerful. So you get into this weird situation where you're like, wow, I'm over the pedals. There's a psychological component to you. Like, I feel more powerful because you're using a lot of glute and a lot of quad and no hamstring. So when you're kicking that pedal because your seat's too far forward, the paradox is that it feels very powerful, but when the effort goes and turns into a cardiovascular effort over 20, 30, 40 minutes and beyond, into those 3-4 hour efforts for like an Ironman or something, when it starts to turn into a long effort, you start to get excessive quadricep fatigue, and calf almost always comes with that, which does not only inhibit your ability to run when you get off the bike, but it becomes inefficient. You start basically murdering one particular chain of muscles and not evenly spreading the fatigue over the large muscle groups. So if your seat is too far forward, you will just kill your quads and you'll kill your calves. You won't be able to run very well, and you'll actually go slower. So you'll notice if you've got a power meter, the paradox is when the seat's further forward, you feel better on short efforts, but worse on long efforts. So you don't want to shove the seat too far forward. A good rule of thumb is that you should feel the very similar sensations of the pedal stroke to what you feel on your road bike, right? So you should feel like you're a little bit further forward, maybe 5 to 10 millimeters of less seat setback, so the seat's further forward, and maybe 5 to 20 millimeters higher. This depends a bit on how much you roll your pelvis forward on the TT bike. As you roll your pelvis forward, the center of rotation of your hips goes down and forward. So your seat does need to be a little bit higher and a little bit further forward. But if you feel hugely further forward, or the seat measures like 80 millimeters further forward or 50 millimeters further forward, it's probably too far forward. So the biggest thing that I change with, I won't say everyone that comes in with a time trial position for an Ironman or something like that, but for a lot of people, the biggest error that I see is that the seat is just massively far forward. And they do it for what on the surface sounds like sound biomechanical reasons. I can open up my hip angle, I can get lower, etc., etc. But huge amounts of experience have taught me that basically running the seat slightly further forward and slightly higher than their road bike saddle position is hugely more efficient across that pedal stroke torque, delineation, like that torque application to the pedal, that over long efforts, it becomes a huge downside if the seat is too far forward. And so that is one of the things that you want to avoid in a time trial position. It should feel fairly similar in terms of the spread of fatigue to your road bike position. And if it doesn't, if you feel like you're way out in front of the bottom bracket, move the seat further back. Yeah, and you'll have no trouble getting the seat forward. Modern TT bikes, the seat tube angles are effectively so steep. They've just gone hook, line and sinker down this path that everything is just so forward to sort of cater to this sensation that people have got, that you'll often end up, to achieve good balance of muscle fatigue across the stroke on a time trial bike, you'll often have the seat a long way back on the rails. Don't look at it and go, it's too far back. Don't worry about what it looks like. Worry about what it feels like. You should have nice, smooth control and of the bottom of the stroke, just as you do on your road bike, and you should have a lot of hamstring engagement across the bottom of the stroke and a sense of smoothness, rather than feeling like you're kicking the pedals that are out behind you. That's a big indicator that your seat's too far forward. So yeah, that's one of the things it's a bit of a trap, because it feels more powerful, but as soon as the effort becomes a cardiovascular effort, anything longer than about half an hour, you'll go slower. Yeah. So if you're doing sprint distance or something, or really short club time trials, being really forward and dropping the front end right down may actually be worthwhile if your terminal speeds are very high and if the effort is very short. But for something like a sprint, anything longer than about a sprint distance, and you're going to be much better off utilizing all those big muscle groups, spreading the fatigue so you can run better when you get off the bike, and keeping the seat a little bit further back than you would think.